Heart disease is the #1 killer in the world. And yet, most of the advice you're given to reduce your risk is just plain wrong. In fact, over the last 50 years, the mainstream advice didn't just make it worse, it turned heart disease into an epidemic. Hello, health champions. Today we're going to talk about some of the absolute worst advice your doctor gives you about heart disease, and we're going to carefully explain why it's just plain backwards. We're going to break this into 5 categories, and the first one is when you're told to avoid saturated fat. We've been told to cut out red meat and eggs and butter and saturated fats. And this is based on bad intuition, because as humans, we think that if we have fat on the body, it must have come from fat that we ate. That's a jump that we're very inclined to make. Also, when they examined atherosclerotic plaques, then they found saturated fat and cholesterol in them. So they thought, hey, there must be because we eat saturated fat and cholesterol. Unfortunately, that has nothing to do with it. And this trend of bad advice started in the late 1950s, early 1960s, based on something called the 7 countries study. But this was really, really bad research, because you would think that if they call something the 7 countries study, maybe it was based on the fact that they had investigated 7 countries. No. They studied 22 countries. They took data from 22 countries, but they picked the 7 that best fit the idea they wanted to promote, that saturated fat caused heart disease. But I want to tell you about some very, very interesting things that they have found since then. That in the 1960s, the body fat composition, the type of fats that people had in their bodies, 9% of it was linoleic acid, or omega-6. But in 2008, the amount of the same type of fatty acid, the omega-6, was 21.5%. So it had increased by 136%. So the types of fat we eat are the ones that eventually end up in our body tissues to some degree. Okay, they don't cause plaque, and saturated fat is a little different because we make it, but omega-6 is not something that your body makes. It is something that you have to eat. And remember how I said that they found saturated fat in the plaques, and they said, oh, that's why we need to avoid saturated fat? Well, in another study, they found that plaques correlate. The type of fat that you find if you cut open a plaque, it correlates with the type of fat you have in your body overall. And they had a correlation here of an R value of 0.89, which means it's an extremely strong correlation, and 0.7 is a strong correlation. So 0.89 is about as good as you're ever going to find in this type of research. And in 1960s, when they checked, they found mostly saturated fat in the plaques, but in the 2000s, they found mostly omega-6 fats. So it wasn't that the fat caused the plaque, it's that the inflammation caused the plaque, but the body included whatever fat was most abundant. So in recent years, the type of fat that you find in the plaque is not the one that your doctor said to avoid. Now here's an argument that they very often bring up. And it is a fact that saturated fat can increase LDL. Not in everyone, but on average, it probably will. However, it will increase primarily the fluffy LDL, the large, buoyant LDL, which is not atherogenic, meaning it does not form those plaques, because the large is healthy. The small damaged LDL is what slips through the walls of the blood vessels and causes those plaques. And the other side of the story is that when you decrease saturated fat, which is actually what happened, then you're going to increase your carb intake and your consumption of omega-6s. And what happens now, with more carbs, you increase insulin resistance, which leads to inflammation, and higher amounts of omega-6 also increase inflammation and metabolic risk. So here we're talking about the core mechanisms of heart disease that you increase by cutting back on your saturated fat. And here's another thing they often fail to point out is that saturated fat doesn't just increase LDL and the healthy kind, it also increases HDL. And when we look at one of the most basic risk factors that you can get on basic blood work is that if you look at the ratio between total cholesterol and HDL, it usually goes down, which is very, very healthy. And I want to expand on the story about how fat gets converted into different things. That it's not the fat we eat that ends up necessarily in the body. So cows is where we get a lot of that saturated fat if we eat the meat from a cow. But cows eat grass, and grass contains an omega-3 fatty acid called ALA. That's a polyunsaturated fatty acid. So does that mean that the cow actually gets its energy from omega-3? No. The cow actually gets 70% of all its calories from saturated fat, saturated fatty acids. It gets about 30% of its calories from protein. And listen carefully here. It gets 0% of its calories from carbohydrate. When we're talking about the nutrients, the macronutrients that reach the blood that actually provide the energy for the cow, none of it comes from carbohydrate and 70% of it comes from fat. And the cow doesn't rely heavily on glucose, but it does have blood glucose, and all the glucose it needs, it makes from one of these saturated fats, a short-chain fatty acid called propionate. But when we eat the cow, now we're getting mostly stearic acid, which is a saturated fat, and we're getting monounsaturated fat in form of oleic acid, like in olive oil. We're getting roughly half each of those from beef. So how does that happen? Well, these 70% of saturated fatty acids are a form called VFAs, or volatile fatty acids, because they're so short chain fatty acids that they're volatile. They evaporate at body temperature. And there's also some ketones in there. And the cow uses that for energy. That's its primary source of energy. But the excess that becomes body fat stored in the tissues gets converted from these short-chain fatty acids, the VFAs, into stearic acid and oleic acid. So that is essentially what we're eating, roughly half of these saturated and monounsaturated fatty acids. So whether it's a cow or a human, it depends very little on what they eat in terms of what gets stored in the body. If it's something that we can convert into saturated fat and oleic acid. So the cow does that exactly like you do. And if you eat carbohydrates, then they get converted into stearic acid and oleic acid, just like the cow. So we want to understand that it's not about the classification of saturated fat or monounsaturated or polyunsaturated. Those are just buckets, classifications of the chemical structure. What matters is, how does this fat behave? Is it stable or does it get easily oxidized? And what sort of downstream biological signaling does it result in? And saturated fat is very stable. It's basically inert. It doesn't react with hardly anything, can't get oxidized. Very, very difficult to do that. So that means we can store it, and when we eat it, it doesn't cause a bunch of free radicals and things like that. Monounsaturated fat is also quite stable. That's basically olive oil. You could leave that out. It doesn't need refrigeration, and you can stick it on the counter for months and months without it going bad. However, polyunsaturated fatty acids, they are very unstable. Both omega-6s and omega-3s are even more unstable. But omega-6s, if you leave them out, they get rancid and oxidized very quickly. And why that matters is because then you're going to increase the amount of oxidation of reactive oxygen species and free radicals, and also of inflammation, which is the primary driver of heart disease. So when they told people to cut back on red meat and butter and instead increase the vegetable oils, the polyunsaturated fats, what actually happened was that they made the situation dramatically worse. So in the case of humans, because we can't break down grass and get short-chain fatty acids like the cow, the best mix of stable energy for humans is a good mix of monounsaturated, meaning olive oil, and saturated fatty acids from meat, butter, and eggs. And the second piece of really bad advice that you're getting is that your LDL cholesterol is the problem and you must get that number down. But see, most LDL is made in the body because we need cholesterol. It's very, very important for the body. And LDL is just the carrier. LDL stands for low density lipoprotein. It's a carrier of cholesterol so that we can get the cholesterol to the places in the body where it's required. But LDL only becomes a problem. It only becomes harmful to us when it's oxidized and glycated. Those are the two things that turn it atherogenic so that it can form plaques. And here's the sad part, that those conditions are created by insulin resistance, by excess omega-6s, by sugar and smoking. All of the things, including smoking, that they told you to do 50 years ago, but since then they pulled back on smoking and sugar, but they still tell you to eat excess omega-6s and high carbohydrate diets that cause insulin resistance. And when you follow these recommendations, then that causes small, dense, damaged LDL. So now when these LDL particles go out to try to distribute the cholesterol, now there is inflammation present that creates the damage in the blood vessels. And now cholesterol is there to plug the wound, to kind of spackle up the damage. However, when we have these small, dense particles, now they slip through the cracks and they cause problems and they become plaques. Bad advice number 3 is just take this statin. Your cholesterol is over 200, take this statin. This will protect your heart. But the problem with that is that it's much too general. It doesn't take into account the person. So we never want to say that a statin is never a good idea. But when they do it like this, as soon as your cholesterol is 201, you get a prescription. Now they are doing what's called primary prevention. You haven't had a heart attack before, let's try to prevent it. And there's something called an NNT, number required to treat, number needed to treat. So they have to give 100 people a statin drug. They put 100 people on a prescription, and for 99 people, take it for 5 years with no benefit for one person to prevent a death. But notice on all these studies and all these references, they put in 5 years. So what that means is that this was one person who didn't get a heart attack, or one person less that didn't get a heart attack for 5 years. It doesn't mean that that person is going to live longer. It doesn't mean that person is healthier. It doesn't mean that they're not going to get other diseases. But here's the key. These 99 people, it doesn't mean that they're going to live longer or that they're healthier or that they had any positive outcome from this. All we know is they all took this for 5 years for one person to not have a heart attack during that time period. And here's why we want to be very concerned, because statins don't just block cholesterol. They absolutely work to bring down cholesterol because they block a pathway. But that pathway is responsible for producing cholesterol and CoQ10. So when you block the cholesterol pathway, you also block the production of CoQ10, which is the enzyme that your body uses, that your mitochondria uses to make energy. And that energy is called ATP. That's your currency of energy. And when you block CoQ10, you will reduce the production of ATP. That is well established. So with doing that, you're decreasing the amount of energy that your heart, brain, liver, kidneys, and muscle use and need. So these are the organs that use the most, that are the most dependent on energy. But with the statin drug, you're cutting down the energy supply. You're reducing their lifeline, so to speak. And as a result, there are plenty of side effects. The statin drugs have more side effects than just about any other medication. And the muscle side effects are the most common, like muscle aches or muscle weakness or even pathologies. But here's the thing. Muscles will complain. They have lots and lots of pain receptors. I mean, as soon as you walk up the stairs or you run up the stairs a few times, your muscles start burning. They tell you, hey, we are under stress. The problem is the rest of your organs, the internal organs, they don't complain. They have a little bit of pain receptors in the capsule, in the tissue surrounding them, but none of these organs, kidney, liver, brain, or heart, have any pain receptors in the tissue itself. So the damage is done silently. So if 100 people have to take a medication that starves their organs for one person to not have a heart attack during a 5-year period, we kind of have to wonder, what does that do? Is there any damage done silently to all those internal organs? But even with all that, and even though I'm very skeptical to using statins broadly, we shouldn't say that it's never a good idea. We should never say that there are no candidates for this, but we have to understand all the factors and discuss them with a doctor who understands this. So when we're talking about secondary prevention, meaning that someone has had a heart attack before and now we're trying to prevent the next one, now that number needed to treat drops to 25. So it's not the same situation. This is a stronger argument for it. Also, for men who are over 50 with multiple risk factors, and if you have a genetic predisposition, if you're a carrier of something called lipo(a). If one or several or all of these fit, then you should probably consider it. But then on the other hand, you also need to consider the other side of the equation, which is, for example, that statins increase the risk of type 2 diabetes by about 10 to 25%. But then you also have to ask yourself, what else can we do? Can we accomplish some things without the statin, such as lifestyle changes? What if we work actively to reduce insulin resistance? If we reduce C-reactive protein, which is an inflammatory marker? What if we reduce homocysteine, which is another inflammatory marker? And if you still go forward with a statin prescription, then you need to understand the thing about the CoQ10, that it's so strong that many countries will co-prescribe. They will not prescribe a statin without at the same time prescribing CoQ10. It is absolutely essential that they do that. And they prescribe quite hefty doses, like 200 to 300 milligrams per day, and in some cases up to 600 as a therapeutic dose. And if you do that, then you want to have it with a fatty meal because that dramatically increases the absorption. Unfortunately, in many countries, including the United States, chances are that you will not get that recommendation of CoQ10. So remember that if you're ever considering a statin drug, you must take CoQ10 at the same time. Bad advice number 4 is that your triglycerides are too high and therefore you need to reduce your fat intake. So again, it's a case of poor intuition, of unfounded intuition. We see fat in the bloodstream, we think that must come because we're eating too much fat. When in fact, triglycerides in the blood come from carbohydrates and sugar and alcohol and overeating in the presence of insulin, that is how the body makes triglycerides. Because if you eat a bunch of carbohydrates and sugar, your body has a very limited capacity to store it, and all the rest is turned into fat, known as triglycerides. And now what happens is if you buy into that advice and you reduce your dietary fat, you still have to eat something, and protein stays relatively constant. So what happens when you cut back on fat is you will increase your dietary carbohydrates, which is exactly what has happened over the decades based on this advice. And now you're trying to cut back to lower your triglycerides, and in fact, you're creating the exact opposite. You're raising your triglycerides. But we have also found the opposite. All the doctors who recommend a low carbohydrate diet, they find that if you increase your dietary fat and you actively work to reduce your dietary carbohydrates, nothing will drop your triglycerides faster than that. Just realize it's not enough just to raise your dietary fat, because it's possible to eat junk food and muffins and donuts and get plenty of dietary fat and dietary carbs. So you have to understand that it's more about lowering the carbs and then filling in the difference with fat. That's how it works. And this is important because high triglycerides are a direct and strong indicator of insulin resistance, because when there's fat in the bloodstream, it's supposed to go to the cells and the cells are supposed to use it. But if you are insulin resistant, if those cells are overfed, then they resist the fat also, and the fat stays in the bloodstream and it has no place to go. And all of that is exactly why the standard advice that we've been told for decades to eat low-fat, high-carbohydrate diets makes all of this worse. And bad advice number 5 may be the worst of all of them, because it's when you're told, it's a false positive, when you're told you're doing fine based on the wrong markers, and they tell you your cholesterol is below the limit, and they're only talking about total cholesterol under 200, and they're talking about LDL cholesterol under 130, or in some cases even under 100. But that is such a limited and basically completely irrelevant part of the big picture. So you could, at the same time that you have these good markers, you could have an HDL of 35, which is much too low. You could have a VLDL, or remnant cholesterol, of 35, which is way too high. Because the VLDL is basically the particle that carries triglycerides. So there's a direct correlation between VLDL and triglycerides. And if your VLDL is 35, that means that your triglycerides are approximately 175. And there's a very strong risk ratio that you can get from this if you divide the triglycerides by the HDL. In this case, you're going to get a ratio of 5. And this information you can get from very, very basic blood work, but they typically don't calculate or pay attention very much to that ratio, which needs to be around 1. You should have about as much HDL as you should triglycerides. Otherwise, you are at higher risk. But here's the big part of the problem. This is the stuff that they measure, but they don't measure the stuff that really counts. So you could get the message that you're looking good, your numbers are fine, and yet here is all the stuff that you should know that they never test. So if your lipo(a) could be at the same time, could be 75, even if you had these great so-called numbers, that lipo(a) needs to be below 30. And this is a genetic marker, so you don't have to test it every time. You need to test it at least once so you know if you carry that, if you have a tendency toward high lipo(a), because that's a sticky cholesterol that is high risk. With low cholesterol numbers, you could also have an insulin of 14, meaning you're insulin resistant. You are in a state of inflammation that needs to be between 2 and 5. You could have a high sensitivity C-reactive protein, which is an inflammatory marker, of 6. Now, this could go up in the hundreds if you have an acute disease, if you have acute inflammation going on. But if you just have chronic low-grade inflammation that's sort of just like smoldering under the surface with no symptoms, you could have a number of 6, and that needs to be less than 1 if you want to calm that inflammation down. You could be walking around with a homocysteine of 23, for example, and that's an inflammatory marker that needs to be between 5 and 7. Even with a low cholesterol, you could have a bunch of small LDL particles. If you have a lot of inflammatory damage and they shrink your LDL, you could have 800 small LDLs, and there would be nothing on a standard test to set off a flag. You need to keep that below 200, and there's many people who have less than 100. Even with low total cholesterol, you could have an LDL size of, let's say, 19.6, and that is small enough to slip through the cracks and cause damage. You want to have that between 21 and 23. And the small LDL percentage, the number, let's say that you had 800 small particles and you had a total count of 1,200. Now, 67% of those would be small, and you want to keep that under 20% or even under 10. And why does that matter? Because if most of the particles swimming around in your bloodstream are small, that means there is a lot of oxidation and there's a lot of inflammation going on. So it's a great indirect marker for inflammation. And if they had ran a calcium score, they might have found a value of 600, which means significant atherosclerotic plaques that have ruptured and been calcified. So there are more expensive, more sophisticated tests that can also test soft plaques. But here is something that you can do for $100, $150 out of pocket. That's hardly ever done. And the ideal number there would be 0, and extremely low risk would be under 10. So part of the really bad advice is to tell you that your numbers are looking good when they don't check the numbers that really matter. And then you get to hear numbers look fine, really. So instead of those 5 categories of really bad advice, here's what doctors should say. They should tell you, reduce your insulin resistance. And in order to get that, we need to measure insulin, A1C, and blood glucose. What they really should say also is, to check your risk, we really should check your lipo(a) level, your CRP protein level, your LDL particle count. We need to know the size of your LDL, and homocysteine is really good to know to see if your inflammation is under control and if you might be a carrier for the MTHFR genetic variant. And if you like, we can also run a calcium score. We don't have to do that more than every 5 or 10 years. And if you have a 0, if you have very low level, then you are good for probably another 10 years. And then they should tell you that if any of these are high, the way to best control it is with some time-restricted eating, fewer meals, eating your meals in a shorter period of time, and to practice some form of low-carb, high-fat diet. Doesn't mean everyone has to be keto, but it also means you can't reverse any of that eating sugar and 300 grams of carbs per day. He should tell you to stop eating seed oils that are high in omega-6 and pro-inflammatory, and you should replace them with natural, stable, healthy fats that come from meat, fish, eggs, butter, coconut milk, coconut oil, and a good amount of extra virgin olive oil. And then he should tell you to balance that out with a great variety of non-starchy vegetables because they contain fiber and phytochemicals that the bacteria in your biome thrive on. But let me know in the comments below which version you've heard the most of from your doctor, the 5 pieces of bad advice I went over, or how many of you have been told this by your doctor. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.